everyone, and welcome back to Always Watching. Today's Foreign Fridays feature is Return to Seoul. So briefly, the film follows Freddy, a 25-year-old French woman who returns to South Korea for the first time to find her biological parents. Directed by French-Cambodian director Davy Chou. The film is actually inspired by a close friend of his who was adopted by a French couple and actually did return to South Korea to meet with her biological parents. Davy actually started off as a documentarian. His debut, Golden Slumber, investigates the lost cinematic heritage of Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge destroyed all the movies between 1960 and 1975. When he was 25, he took his first trip to Cambodia, and his motivation, of course, was to do research for this documentary. And his grandfather was actually a prolific film producer in Cambodia. He never met him, and so he wanted to go back and sort of retrace his roots, although he didn't know he was doing that at the time. And Davy was born in France to Cambodian parents, so they immigrated to France, and he grew up quite westernized, so he didn't actually know anything about Cambodia prior to visiting Cambodia. And unconsciously, his work there sparked this interest specifically in the topic of home and this ignorance that a lot of second-generation immigrants have about their home country. Personally, for me, I'm a second-generation immigrant, so I'm always interested in these types of stories. We don't really get them often, and I'm finding that more and more these types of movies are coming out. And this relationship between identity and the places we call home, there's this pressure to define yourself either with the country you grew up in, your origin country. So I know plenty of people who went back to the motherland and they found comfort and peace there. And then there's the third category of people that kind of make their own way. You know, they use labels and pronouns and they kind of create their identity that way. You know, so all three are a possibility. And personally, I'm interested in the third category. You know, these people who are able to kind of shapeshift. You know, they can change wherever they go. They can make themselves feel at home regardless of the country they go to. And people like this are fascinating because it's almost like you never meet the same person twice. In this film, Freddy's change is quite seamless. Like, this takes place over a number of years. And you don't actually realize how much you've changed as a person until you look back on yourself. And it's quite startling. Like, these changes happen so gradually over time, but it's such a massive difference. And if you watch the movie, like, it didn't occur to me until a second watch, but I'm like, oh my God, Freddy has changed quite a bit. And she arrives in Korea like a student, kind of this lost backpacker. She doesn't really know what she's doing there. And she kind of leaves a more confident version of herself. And watching Freddy, you know, she takes on a number of challenges. She learns the language. She learns about Korean culture, and she tries her best to make herself feel at home in these spaces and places that she doesn't really know much about, but she makes like an effort to. But despite this effort, she never feels like 100% comfortable there. And for me, this pressure that, you know, Freddy is under, it comes from different people have different levels of self-satisfaction. You know, like some people, in order to feel self-satisfied, they can have a family and kids. Other people, they can get a job and they're perfectly fine. You know, some people, like, it's a bit more extreme. You know, they have to travel the world to feel at peace, right? So your level of self-satisfaction differs depending on the kind of person you are. And Freddy is a shapeshifter, right? She's that category of person that kind of wants to create the labels. She doesn't really want to borrow any to create her identity. And so for her, it gets to that point, right? No place is ever going to make her feel at home until she feels settled within herself. And originally, the movie was supposed to be titled All the People I'll Never Be. And the reason for this is to kind of articulate this experience. So when Davy went to Cambodia, like, it's kind of a trippy experience. Like, if you go to a country where people look like you and they speak the same language, and you have nothing in common with them, like culturally, experience-wise, like references, right? Like, you look the same, but you don't understand each other at all. It's impossible for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes, regardless of how similar we may seem, right? And that's kind of where the inspiration for the title came from. And Freddy's story is quite unique for a lot of reasons, right? This is not about second generation immigrant going back to their home country and trying to find themselves like Davy did. Instead, she was adopted. So her disconnect from her country it wasn't really her choice at all. So this is a very kind of unique story. And, you know, as the film goes on, we learn a lot we get enough information about Freddy. Her adoptive parents seemed pretty great, but they raised her as a French woman. You know, like it seems like the lack of knowledge that Freddy has about South Korea is quite jarring, right? It seems like Korean culture, Korean language, the word Korea, I don't think ever came up in her adoptive family's home, right? She was raised as a French woman, and this creates a weird tension because the longer that she's in South Korea, especially for the first half of the film, she keeps trying to identify herself as a French woman. And the problem with these types of societies is that you don't realize it until you leave the country. But when you're in France or US or any Western country, the emphasis is that you're supposed to assimilate and you're supposed to all be like one and the same. And this is often at the expense of this other identity. So it becomes a weird defense mechanism. I noticed that living abroad, right? I find myself saying I'm Canadian, but not as a proud Canadian, more as I'm not what you think I am. So it's like I'm putting my other identity as you know what I mean? It's like one cannot exist without the other. And it's not even something you notice again until you leave the country. Like I remember with my cousin, she moved to the US when she was 13. And I made a small comment. I said something like, you know, you have an accent, you know, implying that she still had a little bit of an accent from, you know, her time in Kenya. And she took that so, like she was not having it. You know, she's like, no, my accent is American. I said, it's not a bad thing. You know, it's not a bad thing at all. And again, there's so much pride in being all one and the same, especially I'm assuming in France as well, right? Like you're all French. So people take offense when you don't identify them that way. And so that's the experience Freddy is having, right? She is a French woman. She grew up in French society. But at the same time, it's like, how do you do that without, you know, ignoring or making your South Korean identity inferior, right? And that's the problem with Western societies. There's this natural hierarchy that you're not even aware of until you travel. The other thing this movie does well is that it's not very touristy, like Return to Seoul. Like it could have been easily called No Return. You know, I was expecting kind of a lost in translation thing. That's not what happened. Like a lot of her journey happens in these small towns and these small places in Korea. So it's not really a postcard. And the only thing we see of South Korea outside of the clubs that she's in, like it's not really, the movie's very much focused on Freddy and the way she changes every time she comes back to this country. So some background, Freddy's story is not too far from the truth. For about 6 decades, 200,000 plus Korean children, mostly girls, were adopted by mainly white parents in the United States and Canada. And this was because Korea was ruled by a succession of military leaders who saw adoptions as a way to deepen the ties with other countries. And so it was also a way to reduce the number of people to feed, you know, especially getting rid of undesirable children, orphans, children from unwed parents. Like it was just an easy way of making their lives easier, right? Not as many mouths to feed. And so the government went as far as promoting adoptions, which allowed a lot of profit-driven agencies to manipulate records. So adoptees were sent abroad, and they were registered by some agencies as orphans, claimed to have been found abandoned on the streets. And this made the adoption process quicker and easier. If a child doesn't have a parent, it's a lot easier to send them away. And it turns out a lot of these children that were adopted, you know, who believed they were orphans actually had relatives that were quite easy to trace. A lot of adoptees returned to South Korea to try and find their parents, and they came to find out that their identities were switched, you know, and it made it very difficult for them to find out who their parents were or where to start. And so fortunately, this was not the case for Freddy. Like that could have been a whole other movie. Her father left the adoption agency with enough information that if she were to return, she could easily find them. So this movie takes place over 7 years. We never see Freddy in France or any other country besides Korea. And every time she comes back, she's a totally different person. However, despite becoming more comfortable with the place, she still doesn't feel at home, right? She's still not 100% at ease here. And one of the tools this movie utilizes very well is music. And Freddy used to play the piano. And in one scene, she explained something called sight reading. This is when you look over a score for the first time and analyze the music in one glance, evaluate the danger, and jump in. The key is knowing how to read the signs, right? And this applies to both music and life, and I felt this was an appropriate metaphor for Freddy's journey. The movie ends with Freddy outside of Korea, and she's a lot more solemn. She seems a lot more content and on her way to finding peace and happiness. Not only that, the fact that the movie ends outside of Korea is interesting because she's not really anywhere that she has any attachment to. I think her reasons for coming to South Korea was that hope that, you know, somehow, somewhere the pieces would just fit and I would feel like home. And the problem is, like, you know, it sounds corny, but home actually starts within you. Like, you will never feel at peace anywhere if you don't really feel at peace and settled within yourself. And that's the situation with Freddy. And that's the situation with a lot of second-generation immigrants, because if you attach yourself to things like nationality or religion or culture or country, like, you can end up becoming a caricature of yourself. Like, this is not who you are. And so it's kind of a balance, right? These things can enhance you and they can kind of give you root, right? Explain, you know, give yourself a history. But at the same time, you never want to overly attach to these things because you end up just inhibiting your own growth. You know, Freddy's frustration is understandable in a few ways. You know, this idea of movement and always moving around to feel something. Like, I know a lot of people like this. Like, they can't stay in one place. They're actually uncomfortable with the idea of stability. Like, they have to change jobs, they have to change friend groups. And Freddy's journey is fascinating because she kind of goes to South Korea with the expectation of being found. Like, finally, I'll find a group of people who get me, and I don't have to explain myself to anyone. But this is false. You know, people who think like this, it's like, you'll never find peace. Because if you're okay with yourself and you accept yourself, it actually doesn't matter where you go because you'll be comfortable regardless of where you go, right? You will be able to be still in any setting. And that's what happens to Freddy at the end of the movie. She's able to find stillness in a place where she has no connection, no familiarity with, right? And that's really the challenge, right? Like, if you are uncomfortable, you know, in every space or in most spaces, it means there's something about you that you feel is lacking. There's something about you that you don't want people to see. And I felt by the end of the film, Freddy was done hiding behind, you know, people and loud music. You know, and I appreciated Freddy's journey because you don't, the thing about life is that you grow, you change. People don't owe you a past version of yourself. Right? So Freddy doesn't have to explain her changes, right? She's a different person. She's not who she was when she first came to Korea. You know, and for that, she lost a lot of people along the way. And that's okay. You know, it's a necessary evil. And it's something that she's learning to live with. So the movie ends actually quite hopeful because she has a very long, exhaustive journey, but she's on the right track. She's not trying to become a caricature of herself anymore. She's not trying to hide behind, you know, her passport or anything else, right? It's just, this is who she is. You don't have to explain yourself, and, you know, let that kind of guide you, I guess. So, and that's what I appreciated about the end of the movie. Like, Freddy has a very long, exhaustive journey ahead, but there's some hope. She seems like someone who has a lot more direction than when she started. So I've divided my video into several parts, 3 parts, according to how the movie itself was organized. So the first part, this return to Seoul, is actually the longest part of the film and the most important. And Freddy's attitude when she returns to Korea is a mix of emotions. She's a tourist in a place where she's just assumed to be a local, right? It kind of takes the fun out of it because as much as she wants to sightsee and, you know, experience everything in 2 weeks, there's this added burden of, like, you know, who are my biological parents? So from the beginning, the movie utilizes close-up shots. And this is to show us how Freddy tries her best to find commonalities, whether it be facial features, physical or social or cultural, to try and connect with the people around her. But no matter how hard she tries, again, she's never able to bridge that gap. And her decision to travel to Korea is instinctive. and it's just kind of like on the go. Like she arrives almost like a student or a tourist. Like she seems just kind of like, hey, like no plan, just going with the flow. And originally, Freddy was written as a femme fatale character, which is interesting because, you know, I'm kind of glad they didn't go that route. So apparently, the actress who plays Freddy, she's not actually an actress, she's like an artist. She kind of had some things to say. She was like, I am not dressing like that. So they made a lot of changes to Freddy's character. And I appreciated that because it's not distracting. Like she comes off as very approachable. Like you either know a Freddy or you know someone like Freddy. We can't really compare Freddy's behavior in South Korea to anywhere else in the world because we don't know, right? But from what we see, she's not 100% comfortable at the beginning of the movie. And she tries to hide her discomfort by making herself feel at home. You know, so right at the start of the movie, she is checking into this hostel. She meets Tina for the first time, who's ironically this young Korean woman who speaks French, and she removes her headphones because there's a natural barrier between people, right? Like you just wouldn't break, right? And there are people that break those barriers, right? They kind of, you know, they sit too close, you know, they ask too many questions, and you know, it kind of throws people off. Right? And one of the ways that Freddy tries to make herself feel comfortable is by invading other people's personal space. And that creates a sense of intrigue in the people that she's doing that to be like, who are you? You know, and they want to help her. And that's the case with Tina, right? So she's immediately intrigued by this guest, and they kind of become best friends, very good friends in this first half of the movie. So she goes out for the first time, and she's learning about Korean customs. She's quite I don't know, she's quite defensive about it. So every country or culture, they have their way of hosting you or showing you that they care. In Korea, one of the ways they do that is by serving you, right? So they'll refill your drink or, you know, refill your plate if you need it. And so for some reason, Freddy felt very uncomfortable with this. And again, we don't know how she acts in other countries, but this is very unusual. Like if you're a tourist, you wouldn't really question how other people do things, right? You would just kind of let them do things because that's why you're there, to see how other people do things. And at one point in the scene, they're trying to explain that, you know, the reason we're doing this is it's out of respect. And she doesn't really know who that respect is for. And so she starts to pour her own drinks and she starts to serve herself as if to say, you know what, I've been taking care of myself my whole life and I don't really need anyone else to start. And apparently when they were shooting the scene, the actress who plays Tina and the gentleman that she comes in with were actually visibly annoyed, and they were kind of offended. Like the act is actually quite offensive in Korean culture, and he was saying in an interview like he never, you know, he was just directing the scene. He didn't think that it could affect the people like enacting the scene. You know, like they seemed uncomfortable. The actress who plays Tina is also not an actress. She is another artist. So that was something that tripped him out, right? Like they look like, I mean, although it's a movie, they didn't really like the gesture all that much. The scene is very important because it introduces us to Freddy as kind of a rebellious character. Someone who will fight tooth and nail to find peace. And so during the first half of the film, this relationship between Tina and Freddy is really interesting because Tina is exactly what Freddy could have become, right? A Korean woman who speaks French. And right away, Freddy tries to befriend her. She tries to attach to her. You know, Tina does a lot to, you know, help her try and find her biological parents. She's a translator. She does all these things. But there's an arm's length between them. And the reason they're never able to connect on any substantive level, despite Freddy kind of exposing herself, right? So Tina sees everything. She sees the father. She sees all of Freddy's life. She kind of experiences all these things and she's quite affected by it. But for whatever reason, by the end of part one, they're never able to, they don't feel like as close as they should. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that Freddy, the lack of knowledge she has about Korean culture and Korea itself is quite jarring. And I think it's jarring even to Freddy herself, right? There's a lot of jokes. There's a lot of references. There's a lot of things that she's not able to like clue in on. And this makes her feel quite uncomfortable. And so as hard as they try, this gap of knowledge that Freddy has kind of keeps them from fully bonding the way that they should. And Freddy tries very hard, right? So in this first half of the film, when she goes out for the first time, she kind of makes every space her own. She kind of creates a party. She drags people. She rearranges them to sit down, even though she doesn't know what they're saying, even though they don't know what she's talking about. But she tries to be in control, as if to say, like, look, I could be you, or see, I belong here. Like, this isn't so hard. This isn't so easy. But the problem is there's such a gap, right? She's explaining, every time she tries to explain that she's French, they don't really get it, right? Like, they're kind of confused. And it's not really something that she can bring up because she doesn't really know how to bring it up. And so at the end of this first night, like, she blacks out. And this is something that happens frequently. Like, she blacks out quite a bit. So she parties hard and she blacks out. And she wakes up and she has no idea. She has no idea, like, what happened the night before. Her first night in Korea, she has a one-night stand. She has no idea where this guy came from. She wakes up, she tries to regain some control over the situation, but it's just kind of futile. And as the film goes on, her ability to kind of drown herself or distract herself, through alcohol or through partying, it decreases. So since she's here for a short time, she decides to try and meet her biological parents. And the only connection she has to her biological parents is this photo of her as a child with a nurse at the adoption center she was dropped off at. In this meeting, she finds out her real name was Yoon-hee, which means docile and joyful. This agency informs her that it was actually her father that dropped her off and left. Not only did her father drop her off, but he left all their information in case she came back and wanted to speak with them, which, kind of confuses and frustrates her, right? So it seems like she wasn't let go that easily. And so as the movie goes on, I actually did feel a great deal of sympathy for her father because he has a tremendous amount of guilt. It seems that his decision to let her go had less to do with whatever was happening politically in Korea, but more to do with two people who just no longer wanted to be together. And I think her father made the decision despite wanting to keep her because he honestly figured that it's better to have two parents who love you than one. And the other thing I found unusual is that it was the father that was willing to meet with her and not the mother, right? Like, I would understand if the mother gave her up for adoption because she didn't want to be an unwed mother, especially in that culture at that time. And she kind of made that decision. But for the father to have dropped her off, that was kind of a twist to me, because so it seems like he really had a lot of guilt, and her mother doesn't agree to meet with her until the very end of the movie, and even then she decides to cut her off, right? Like, she never sees her mother again outside of that meeting in part 3. It seems like her mother doesn't want anyone to know about Freddy. It seems like her daughter was someone that she kind of erased out of her life and she wanted to move on from. That really surprised me, because for a mother to give up her child like that, like, that's, and then not want to see her, again, this movie doesn't go places that you think it's going to go. In terms of Freddy's adoptive parents, I mean, they seem like very nice people. They seemed actually very hurt by the fact that she came to Korea alone and that, they wanted to do this with her at some point. No time like the present, right? So Freddy just kind of decided to do it herself. And before meeting her father, she almost backs out, right? So he's quick to say yes, and she's a bit scared, right? She's very reluctant. She causes chaos. She agrees to it, but she's kind of petrified because she has no idea what's waiting for her on the other side. She finally arrives at her destination. She's greeted with a homecoming, right? Like, she's met, like, it would be one thing if the father met her one-on-one and he didn't want his family or his new family to see her. Instead, she's greeted by the father, the grandmother, his new family. Like, it was like a welcome home party. Not only that, they were also apologetic. So it seems like her father told everybody as soon as the adoption agency contacted him. It seems like he's been carrying a tremendous amount of guilt over this. His mother has also been very guilty. Like, again, it seems like nobody really wanted to give her up all that easily. And her father's home feels like a home. They feel like a normal family. They have pictures on the wall. And that's the frustrating thing. Like, it's one thing to be adopted from a country that is totally war-torn and you can't return back from, but as hard as life was in Korea at that time, like, she could have grown up in Korea. You know, like, I think she's looking around thinking, like, why did you give me up again? Like, y'all seem to be doing perfectly fine. You know, so it just confuses her, right? The nicer they are to her, the more apologetic they are, the more frustrated she gets, because it's like, why did you do something that you had to apologize for in the first place? The whole time she's with this family, they call her by her Korean name. She never really corrects them, even though she's really annoyed. And she's very careful to be respectful, even though she's quite frustrated. And a lot of this is helped by, the thing with Freddy is that she's lost in translation figuratively, and then also quite literally, right? Like, in the beginning, there's a lot of tension. And thankfully, Tina is there. So this young woman from the hostel comes along to help her translate. And the thing with the translation is that it's mistranslated. So a lot of Freddy's frustration is she's wondering why she's not getting the reaction that she's getting. So for example, she'll say something like, it's none of her business. And then Tina will translate it as, not at this time. You know, like, Freddy will say something like, I'm French, you know, I'm going back to France. You know, and Tina will say, you know, it's not a good time. You know, so Tina, the way people are translating Freddy's words, it's to maintain the peace and respect between people. If you were to translate it directly, it might come off a bit rude. So this is also adding to the frustration, because Freddy is unable to speak for herself, and she's totally dependent on the people around her. And she's 99% sure, like, her words are not coming across exactly as she wants them to. And so when she gets to her father's home, they immediately start overcompensating, right? Her father's like, listen, you can stay here. We'll find you a Korean boyfriend. We'll find you, you can stay, Korea's your home. This is your home. These are your sisters. You know, y'all can kick it. And the problem with her father is that he doesn't mean it to be overbearing. You know, it's not like he has these expectations of her. It's just he's trying to make up for lost time. And she doesn't need a father. His time period of being a father has elapsed. At best, he can be a friend or an acquaintance. And this is not something that he wants to accept. And his overcompensation results in her overcompensation. So she starts, you know, I'm French. Like, she makes that even more of a point. And the whole I'm French thing becomes a defense mechanism to, like, distance herself from them. Like, my adoptive parents were great. I never wanted for anything. Like, she doesn't let him in. And this causes a lot of confusion and frustration because they don't fully understand each other 100%. So she agrees to stay with her father's family for a period of time. And during this time, he's showing her around. And it's a bit frustrating because he's showing her around all these places she could have grown up in. You know, like, it kind of takes the fun out of it because it's like, okay, well, and he's telling her about his family history and the things he used to do with his dad and all these things, and she's like kind of confused about it. It's hard to kind of enjoy yourself. The time that she's there, she doesn't really know how to sit. She doesn't really know how to eat. Like, she could tell she just doesn't really know what to do with herself. And on top of that, it's such a contrast to what she knows, right? Like, in this house, everybody lives together. There's no sense of personal space, right? Like, she's sleeping, you know, literally next to her grandmother. She can't exactly tell her to go away. And I think it's a level of frustration because it's like, okay, you decided to send me away, and now all of a sudden you want to be near me all the time. You know, it's just like, it's really irritating. So I understood her frustration, and I understood why she was tripped out, because an otherwise intimate, sort of loving family reunion is just uncomfortable. You know, it's uncomfortable, it's awkward. Nobody really knows what to do with themselves. She finally leaves, you know, it's quite abrupt, right? She leaves, she doesn't know if she's coming back. They don't know if she's coming back. Her father is a bit disturbed, right? He starts calling her. He never loses contact with her again, right? He sends her emails. He wants her to know that he will never leave her again, despite her desperately wanting him to leave her alone. By the end of it, she's kind of deflated, right? She feels like she opened a door that she maybe shouldn't have. And so she really desperately wants to meet her biological mother to try and figure out what exactly happened, or wash away the taste of meeting her father. And unfortunately for her, her mother was not able to see her at that time. She was not responding to these telegrams. And so she feels a bit incomplete. So part one ends with her, you know, in her comfort zone at the club, at a bar, drinking. And the tone was so deflated, right? And it was interesting watching Tina because she really, you would think she went through Freddy's journey, right? She looks sad, she looks frustrated, she looks, she feels sorry for Freddy because she sees a woman that is of two identities and is not really comfortable in any identity. And there's a scene where she's kind of dancing to this music, and it's a nice scene in isolation. And when she sits back down, everybody's just horrified, right? No one is dancing with her. No one is hype. They're all looking at her like confused, right? They're like, are you okay? And Freddy just starts to try and erase this whole experience, right? She's talking to Tina like, I can't wait for you to visit France. You're going to meet all my friends. You're going to meet we're going to go to all these wonderful places, as if France is some amazing place. Like, now she's really overhyping France. And Tina's just not buying it. And the film ends and their relationship is over, right? So Freddy, in a desperate attempt to feel something or a connection to someone, starts to hit on her, her friend Tina, and Tina just looks at her and says, you're a very sad woman. And again, this connection between intimacy and, being around people, like, it's very hollow. Like, you can be surrounded by people, but, you could feel totally alone, and that's Freddy's situation, right? She tries to attach herself to people, but nothing substantive ever really comes out of it, right? They're very superficial, they're very surface level interaction. It ends with her father coming to see her at her hostel, basically yelling at her, telling her, why aren't you answering my calls? And she just screams at him. She says, leave me alone. And Tina's there mistranslating, being like, she's very tired, she'll call you later. That's how the first part of the movie ends, and it ends so dramatically because you're like, there's no way she's coming back here, right? She's gonna block, delete everyone, and she's never gonna come back. So she had quite a life-altering experience in this first half. And then we get to part two, staying in Seoul. And part two surprised me quite a bit because not only did she come back, she's living there, right? It seems like she's made a home of this place. And we come back 2 years later, and her vibe is totally different, right? She seems more confident. She seems less lost, less distracted. She doesn't need a translator or a guide, right? She's able to move through these streets quite, she seems to know where she's going. And she seems to have found some comfort in a place where a few years ago, she didn't know where to begin. This part begins on Freddy's birthday, and she's going on a Tinder date with a much older Frenchman who would later give her a lucrative job opportunity. This happens a lot with Freddy, where she boomerangs from French to Korean. Like, there's this boomerang effect. And that's in an attempt to find some sort of commonality or some type of familiarity with someone. And when you're living abroad, it's very strange because there is a comfort actually in speaking to someone from the same place as you and has the same cultural references. Like, not what you look like, it's what you know, right? Like, it's very refreshing to go back and people understand you, right? Like, you don't have to explain yourself. And she's on a date with this much older Frenchman, and I seriously doubt if she was in France, she would go out with this guy. When you live abroad, you kind of romanticize your home country and people in your home country, so maybe somebody you wouldn't have given attention to suddenly becomes a rarity. So she probably swiped right because he was the only Frenchman on that app. And I've done that before because you're like, oh my God, the only person that, you're so desperate to talk to someone that gets you. And so she's on this Tinder date, and she's a bit sad because we find out in part two that her mother does respond to her and tells her that she explicitly does not want to see her. So it seems like during this time she had been sending her mother telegrams, and her mother hasn't been responding, but a few days ago, she responded, giving her a no. It's one thing not to get a response, it's another thing to just get a no. So she's on this Tinder date, and she just wants to forget, right? It's just like a one-night stand that's supposed to go away. And, the whole time she's looking at him, they couldn't have been more, they have besides speaking French, these two are from totally different worlds. But again, there is that familiarity when you meet someone from the same background as you, because it's like you can kind of say what you want to say, and the odds of them getting you feel is higher, even though that might not be true. Again, we romanticize things when we're not around them. So in part two, Freddy is at a crossroads, it seems her ability to numb herself with alcohol and drugs is getting weaker and weaker. Since we last left Freddy, she got a Korean boyfriend. She seems to have adopted Korean culture. She's finally learned how to eat her noodles, right? She seems very comfortable. And she's even in contact with other Korean adoptees. And, she seems to be finding her groove, at least at first. And Freddy's relationship with Korea is still on ice, to be honest. Instead of a hostel, she's living with this tattoo artist in this sketchy part of town. And I thought it was interesting that, again, her time in Korea, in this part, like, she's still not part of, it's almost she's hidden away. I don't know if it's because she doesn't want to be seen. She's kind of found a group of people that are also outside of mainstream Korean society, right? He kind of lives in this dark alley, and they kind of go to these clubs, and they hang out in the dark, right? Like it's such a, like, as comfortable, although she's more comfortable, she's not like 100% comfortable. This is the saddest chapter of all three, which is why it's spent mostly in a club. A lot of the decisions that Freddy makes are very right here, right now. Like, they're very, like, her decision to keep sending her mother telegrams, it's hard to know. It's almost like she was forcing an answer, and unfortunately she got an answer that she didn't want. This initial rejection is causing some frustration, and she kind of takes it out on this friend of hers from France. So during her surprise birthday party, a friend of hers from France, who's another adoptee, comes to wish her a happy birthday. And the way she's dressed, she's in this glittery dress. She seems very posh, like such a contrast to Freddy. And the vibe I get from Freddy is that even in France, she didn't really fit in. And so maybe she found comfort in this community of Korean adoptees who are also looking for their parents. And it seems like she was trying to help guide them. And so this young woman in particular, kind of informs her, during this time she's learned the language, the culture, but she hasn't actually approached the adoption agency. And this triggers Freddy because she's like, why haven't you gone to the adoption agency? Like, you might not get a meeting, right? So, she's a bit frustrated because she's not getting the outcome that she would like. And seeing her friend so optimistic about the possibility of meeting her biological parents is quite triggering for her, especially considering the fact that she's doing a lot of the things that maybe she should have done before coming to Korea, right? So this friend of hers has learned the language, the culture, and she wants to be ready before meeting her biological parents, to be ready for all outcomes. This club scene is so chaotic. So Freddy is on a bunch of drugs. She's the center of attention, yet she feels totally lonely. She's trying to, like, forget, right? Like, put on a happy face. It's her birthday. But in the end, like, she's just as alone as when she first came. She blacks out that night, and then she wakes up and she has no idea what happened. And this is quite scary because it's like, how did you even get here? And the only time we see her interacting with someone, like, there's a scene where she's thanking this old Korean woman for some food that she gave her, but it's very awkward. Again, like, is that something you would do in Korean culture? So as much as she's trying to learn the culture, there's still a disconnect in terms of what you should be doing and what you should not be doing, what's expected and what's not expected, and that's not something she's able to figure out yet. Party ends, and she's going through her email address, and as we're ending part 2, she gets an email from her father. So it seems like her father has been aggressively emailing her, but she hasn't really been keeping contact. And one of the emails he sends her is of a happy birthday with him and his 2 daughters. And she starts laughing, and I'm not sure if she's laughing in pain or if she's laughing because the picture is funny, because there's this family that she's not a part of, right? It's a very cute picture, but here she is alone with no place to go. And this triggers her to call her boyfriend back in France, right? She picks up the phone and she calls this boy in France and, like, did you miss me? And again, she kind of boomerangs back and forth. When she's uncomfortable in one space, she goes back to a space that she's comfortable in. And then when she's uncomfortable there, she swings back to, it's like a boomerang effect. And that's how part 2 ends. Like, at this point, she's tried to fit into Korea and she's done, right? And you think, okay, this is definitely it. I was waiting for the part of the movie where we see her in France, but that never happens. right? So the final part of the movie, again, where we come back to Seoul. But this is the last time she will be in Seoul, right? She's here briefly on a business trip. She's not living there. She's staying at a hostel. And she looks totally different. Like her vibe is different, her energy is different. And we're kind of reintroduced to her as this young professional working woman who's alcohol free. She doesn't eat meat. And, you know, she's back with her stable, attractive boyfriend. So at face value, she looks like she's super stable. But still, when you peek behind the curtain, there's something up. And this decision to kind of give up alcohol and partying, you know, her last kind of drug that she's unable to give up until the end of the movie is this kind of need to be around people, even if you don't connect with them. And in this case, her boyfriend kind of represents that. Although she's kind of made these massive changes in her life, she still feels like, she even says it, she said, this place is toxic for me, right? She still feels like there's something missing. Her boyfriend, Maxime, you know, they're on their way to this dinner date and he feels like a warm body. Doesn't feel like, you know, someone that she has this deep connection with. The vibe I got is over these last 5 years, she's found a way to keep contact with her father. Though this is the first time she's seeing him in a lot of years, you know, her vibe is a lot different, right? She doesn't look at him with resentment or anger or frustration. Instead, she feels really sorry for him. You know, she's very careful not to hurt his feelings. Like, she seems to really empathize with him a lot more than she did, you know, obviously at the start of the movie. Freddy, interestingly enough, she comes back to Korea and she's apparently an arms dealer, and she got her job from that Tinder date she was on in part 2. And actually, the character of Freddy is based on the director's friend who did actually work as an arms dealer for 10 years. He was saying in an interview that when his friend became an arms dealer, everyone was shocked. Like, they didn't really understand why she had made this decision. And I think the motivation was to become something that no one would expect you to become, because her job doesn't really fit her personality, you know. And that's the thing about Freddy. She's constantly subverting people's sort of opinion of her, right? Like, she's never the same person she was. Right? She's always something totally different. And that speaks volumes to her adaptability. Like, she's able to adapt anywhere she goes. But that has downsides, right? Like, she's also able to look back and forget you completely. But in this case, she was very careful to not cut off her father. This dinner scene was so different from when she first came to Korea. Like, she's able to speak Korean a little bit. She's opening up about, you know, all the things she had been doing. Her boyfriend seems well accustomed to Korean culture. Like, you know, he's pouring drinks. Like, he's kind of, like, they seem very relaxed. There's less tension than there was. And I think the saddest part of this scene is when her father basically, it turns out he had been learning the piano. And the vibe I got from her father is that he has been trying to do his best to connect with her, but it's not working. And one of the ways he tries to connect with her is by playing the piano. And so he wrote this song that he wanted them to listen to, and it's a very short, very simple melody. And the whole time he's playing this recording, he can't even look at her, right? He can't even look at her, and she's looking at him, and she feels very bad, right? She feels she can kind of see the sadness in his eyes, and again, there's not much he can do. Right? He can't really make up for lost time. People change, you know, like Freddy changed, but a lot of the people she's interacted with in this short time have changed, because at the end of that dinner scene, her father is the one ushering her into a cab, you know, letting her go, when before this would have been an impossibility. So it seems like some part of him has accepted that he can't be her father, and so all he can do is maintain this bond and appreciate it for what it is. I think it must be really terrible to have a daughter that you will never know. And I think that's what that song was about, right? Like, you're trying to connect with someone that you will never fully understand, and that's just the demon you got to deal with. Like everything else in Korea, like all her experiences in South Korea, like nothing goes according to plan, right? She was expecting to feel a certain way, but nothing happened, right? And this leaves her feeling kind of confused and a bit frustrated, and she takes this frustration out on Maxime. And she says something really interesting to him. She says, you know what? I can erase you, right? I can wipe you away with a snap of my fingers. And he looks at her like, excuse me? And this whole idea of like, I can wipe you away, it's basically like, you don't mean anything to me. Like, you're only as good as how you make me feel. And you can tell by the end of this movie, they were no longer together. And so to kind of get rid of this feeling, she decides to go partying, right? Instead of going back to the hostel. And they do say old habits die hard. And so she blacks out again. She wakes up in an alleyway, which was quite terrifying because she has no idea how she got there. Whether or not she went clubbing with her boyfriend, whether or not they parted alone, whether or not, like what happened, we don't know. But whatever it was, she ends up alone in an alleyway and just no idea what happened. As someone who tried to present a level of self-control, it goes away in seconds, right? Like she was doing so well, she had given up meat, she was doing yoga. This encounter with her father, you know, just kind of snapped something inside her, right? She just totally unraveled. Okay, so before leaving, she gets a message from the adoption agency saying that her mother is willing to meet with her. And it seems that actually, despite the laws, the adoption agency kind of went out of its way to try and convince Freddy's mother to meet with her. Because legally, they had no more telegrams to send, right? So this was quite a surprise to Freddy, and she immediately goes over to this adoption agency. She's like, what's up? Like, I got your message and I'm here. And she's meeting her mother in a much different state than when she first came, right? She looks much more mature, much more calm. There's no anger, there's no resentment, there's nothing, you know, there's no emotions at this point. She's just tired, and she's just open to whatever is happening. It's almost like by the end of the movie, she has no expectations of anyone. And so during this meeting, the adoption agency gives her a file, and the report gives us some insight into what Freddy was like as a child. It seems like she was a very affectionate child who would get agitated or sad if left alone. And it even said she only calms down when she's around people. And this is a pattern that continues until her adulthood, right? Like she is not comfortable being alone. She either needs to be with someone or around people. And people who always need to be around people, they can't be with themselves, right? And the reason they can't be with themselves is because they don't really like who they are, right? And by the end of the movie, Freddy starts to accept and appreciate who she is, even though it may not be the easiest thing. And apparently when writing this ending, so this ending is what kind of sold me on the film, because it could have actually gone many different ways. And they apparently did so much research, like so many drafts of this were written. And the woman that actually Freddy meets with is someone who has worked at an adoption agency. And they were a lot of the research they did into this last scene was trying to discuss like, okay, how would such a meeting go? You know, like what actually takes place during this meeting? You know, you can't have it be too dramatic. You can't have it be too under dramatic. Like, how do you walk the line, right? Because if this scene doesn't work, the whole film pretty much collapses. And during their research, like one of the questions they ask is like, okay, so what did they ask before the meeting? Because the meeting is one thing, but how do you prepare them for this meeting? And this woman told them like, actually one of the things the parent asks is, can I touch the child? And can you imagine asking for permission to like hug or touch your child? Like that's the saddest thing in the world, right? Can I touch her? Like, oh my God. Like, and that's kind of what they went off of. This last scene was perfect, right? It was just tears. There's no catching up. Like there are no words to explain all the things they want to say to each other. And even if they were to have that conversation, it's just like, there's like a sense of relief at the end, right? Freddy is just happy. She's sad. She's a mix of emotions. And even for her mother, right? Like I imagine this is not something that she wanted to relive, right? Like if you gave up your child for adoption, she probably tried to erase her from her memory. So the scene was so simple. It was so well done. And the only sort of interaction besides this hug is this email address that the mother gives her. And I felt the scene was, you know, it had the effect that it needed to, because again, there's just nothing else to say. So 1 year goes by. So the movie ends 1 year later on Freddy's birthday once again. And she's in a totally different country. She's no longer in South Korea. And she looks pretty posh, you know, she looks pretty good. Like when you compare her fit to the first in part 1 where she kind of looked like a student, you know, she looks very professional. Like she's a wandering, but she looks like she knows how to wander. You know, it looks like she's been wandering for a while. Like she's been to a few countries. Like that's the energy you get. And so she checks into this hotel, and apparently she's in Romania. Like that's what I read in my research. They shot the last part in Romania. And she goes to the bathroom and she decides to send her mother an email address. Now, the feeling I got is that she hasn't used the email since their meeting. Or maybe she has, I'm not sure. My feeling is that she didn't. And the message she sends her is, I think I'm happy and I hope you are too. And then she comes to realize that the email address no longer works. So her mother has severed ties and that's it. Right, so like there will be no communication from here on out. Instinctively, her heart is broken, right? She wants to run away. She's about to leave, and then she spots this piano, right? And as soon as she spots the piano, she decides to sit down. And throughout this movie, music has been kind of a refuge for Freddy, you know, somewhere she can kind of jump into, relax, be herself. And I think that's why she enjoyed going to these clubs or sort of loud spaces, because she can kind of just be without having to do anything. Freddy is a mover, right? She goes from place to place to place to place, but she's never still, right? So this is the first time we're seeing her still. And all this movement, like sometimes you don't really know why you're doing things until after, right? Like, and this is the part of the film where she has to reflect. So she sits down, she starts playing the piano, and it's very calm, right? It's very quiet. The vibe is totally different than what we've seen in her own music, as corny as it sounds, right? Normally she's adapting, right? Like that's why she likes these clubs a lot, because she's able to kind of figure out what the vibe is and jump right in, right? Whereas towards the end of the movie, she has to create the vibe, and that's a lot slower, that's a lot calmer, it's less chaotic, right? So I really appreciated Freddy's journey for a lot of things. Like, you know, a lot of Freddy's frustration and anger, it's very understandable. You know, like I totally understand where she's coming from. I think the reason she moves a lot and the reason that she's always around people is because she needs to feel something, to do something. And at the end of the movie, there's nothing to do, there's nothing to say. You know, like it's really kind of heartbreaking. And I think the main thing this movie does well is that it presents the journey in a few ways. First, Freddy as a human being, from when we first saw her to the end of the film, is a totally different person, right? Like people change, people grow. During that time, she's had to let a lot of people go, right? And the reason for that is because for her to kind of get to where she needs to be, she needs to figure out who she is first, right? Like home really is where the heart is. Like you will never feel at peace anywhere if you don't feel at peace with yourself. Like you'll always be searching and you'll never find home, you know. And it's very frustrating because people who always search, you know, for a place to call home, it's like you're looking to be found, right? And that's basically what was going on in South Korea, right? Like waiting for someone to see who you really are, to appreciate who you really are. But that's, you know, that's a rabbit hole, right? Like overall, I thought this was a fantastic movie. You guys let me know what you think, and until next time.